All right, I now want to address, to some degree, the social aspects, but mostly the economics of the Porfiriato. During the Porfiriato, 9 out of 10 Mexicans lived in farming communities, and the most important issue facing the president was land ownership among these agrarian workers known as campesinos. And this is a problem as old as Mexico itself. Under colonial rule, land had largely been divided between ejidos, which were worked by all villagers in common or subdivided into tiny subsistence plots. These were owned by Indians, and haciendas, which were sprawling farms and or ranches owned by one family, and that family was white. And these were old, almost feudal sort of grants. And haciendas often spread over 10,000 acres and employed more than 100 field hands. Now, Diaz believed haciendas were more efficient than ejidos. Actually, he would have preferred more commercialized, modern, industrialized sorts of farms, and the haciendas were in some ways more antiquated than that. But because of their size, they at least had efficiencies of scale, and he believed them superior to ejidos for increasing production. And he therefore allowed wealthy landowners to strip millions of acres from ejidos. This was done by misusing an 1856 law, part of the Constitution of 1857, the reforms leading up to that, designed to break up large land holdings owned by the church. And so that the hacendados, the hacienda owners, sort of subverted this law to use it to take ejido land. Indians fought the haciendas in court, but most judges, of course, owed their jobs to Diaz, and the hacendados increased their land holdings. These Porfiriato land policies created a massive stratification of wealth in land. Landless people increased in number, and some haciendas became the largest farms on earth. The Terrazas family of Chihuahua, for example, owned over 7 million acres. Here we see the family patriarch, Don Luis Terrazas. The Cedros clan of Zacatecas owned over 4 million. Foreigners frequently bought land taken from Indians. William Randolph Hearst, the super powerful yellow journalist, owned a ranch in northern Mexico. In fact, his father had started it, but under Hearst it grew to 1 million acres. And upon first visiting it when he was a younger man, he wrote home that he didn't see why Americans shouldn't own all of Mexico. By contrast, the number of landless Mexicans increased every year. In 1859, before the Porfiriato started, 20% of the people owned a small plot or share at least of an ejido. In 1910, only 2% claimed to be landowners. This expropriation of land, of Indian land, was not done without protest. Protest and actual shooting wars were common. Indian protesters in Hidalgo were buried up to their necks and ridden over by mounted rurales. The Yaqui Indians of Sonora, Yaqui is Y-A-Q-U-I, they barricaded themselves in the hills, beginning a war of unusual barbarity. Cash bounties were given to anyone bringing in a Yaqui ear or hand. So a new class of landless people arose in Mexico that were exploited by the large plantation owners. One such infamous tobacco plantation in Oaxaca was the Valle Nacional. Had workers sign contracts, but of course they couldn't read. The result was virtual slavery. Food, clothing, and quote-unquote legal fees were deducted from wages, and the worker would be shocked to realize at the end of the month that they actually owed money. Debts would then be passed on to children. And so this resulted in virtual serfdom. Working conditions were horrific, and workers were given a starvation diet. Beatings were common. The American writer John Kenneth Turner interviewed a Valle Nacional plantation owner who claimed by the 6th or 7th month they began to die off like flies at the first winter frost. The cheapest thing to do is to let them die. There are plenty more where they came from. Now, certainly Diaz was aware of the conditions in rural Mexico. Journalists wrote about it. There were Mexican muckrakers, just as there were American muckrakers and progressives, and Diaz was said to have wept at the loss of one particular village's ejido land to a hacienda. But he was determined to bring Mexico into an age of industrial and agricultural efficiency. Ejidos were an old-fashioned institution. The policies of the president took a new twist about 1900 when he fell under the influence of a group of businessmen called científicos, scientists. Headed by Finance Minister José Limantour, the científicos believed the problems of government and the economy could be solved by the proper application of scientific principles. These aren't really scientists, but they're people who ascribe to Frederick Winslow Taylor's principles of scientific management that were transforming industry. As an example, científicos sought foreign investment in Mexico to continue economic development and ensure that foreign investors, would find low wages, low taxes, no labor unrest, and heavy government subsidies for investing in Mexico. This is not unlike the Redeemer South of the same period. The científicos were all whites whose families arrived after independence. José Limantour, for example, this finance minister, you may think, well, that's a French name. Well, it is. His father was a French immigrant. And they believed that Indians and mestizos were suitable for manual labor only. Therefore, American and European businessmen were allowed to bring in their own middle managers and skilled personnel. The mestizos and Indians, who made up 90% of the population, were relegated to the lowest jobs. Until the rise of the científicos, Diaz ruled dictatorially, but he ruled like a Mexican, with a cabinet that favored businessmen, including mestizos and even Indians. Although mostly of Indian blood himself, he acceded to the white supremacist ideas of the científicos in the interest of economic development. Soon American companies ran Mexico's railroads, owned 3/4 of its mines, and more than half its oil fields. American investment in Mexico grew to $1 billion. That was more than Mexican investment in its own country. Foreign firms came to own about a third of the Mexican economy. Britain acquired gold and silver mines. The French operated the textile mills in Veracruz. Spaniards owned tobacco and coffee plantations. This gave rise to the saying, Mexico, mother to foreigners, stepmother to Mexicans. This foreign investment was greatly resented by Mexicans. And it did provide jobs, but it did little to improve the lives of Mexicans. In fact, the influx of foreign money raised the cost of corn and other necessities, hurting them. Wages remained low, that was científico policy, and worker unrest was severely repressed, and that was the promise the científicos made to foreigners. And in terms of price of corn, which is a good measure of the standard of living in Mexico, the Mexican worker earned less in 1910 than in 1810. Human labor had become so cheap that it cost more per day to rent a mule than to hire a man. Diaz grew graceful and respected with age. After his wife died, he married the 18-year-old daughter of a científico, and she was very cultured and dignified. And she taught the old president social niceties, such as proper table manners and the etiquette of formal dinners. She also busied herself with civic projects like planting trees along Mexico City's boulevards. Because of Mexico's economic progress, world leaders heaped praise on Diaz. He was strong enough to end the coups and rebellions that had plagued Mexican politics and imposed order. He had resolved the debt crisis that had resulted in French intervention in the 1860s, although, of course, he did so at a cost of great foreign investment. And he had industrialized a once backward land. Teddy Roosevelt suggested that Washington could have used a guy like Diaz. In fact, he was once quoted as saying, Teddy Roosevelt, saying that Porfirio Diaz might have brown skin, but he has the soul of a white man.